Hey guys, welcome to 12 Tone. Today we're going to talk about bass. Bass is, in my opinion, the most underrated instrument in a rock ensemble. For the most part, the only time anyone notices the bass is when something goes wrong. If your bass line is written well and your bassist is nailing it, they may wind up almost invisible, which is a shame because they're incredibly important. They provide the underlying foundation of the music and bridge the gap between the rhythmic and harmonic sections. You may think of bass as just a heavy, four-stringed guitar, and it sort of is. The construction is very similar. You still have the body, the neck, the strings, the frets. If you've seen our guitar video, this should all be very familiar to you. The strings are even tuned the same as the lowest four strings on a guitar, E, A, D, and G, just an octave down. Some bassists like John here also have a fifth string that plays a really low B. However, the way bass is played and written for is completely different, and understanding it can be the key to taking your arrangements from good to great. The first major difference is that bass rarely plays chords. Notes played that close together that low tend to sound incredibly muddy, and most of the time we don't want that. Some musicians, especially prog and jazz players, will use them, but they're not particularly common, and if you don't need them, I'd recommend avoiding it. Another thing to keep in mind is that while it plays notes, bass is typically considered a member of the rhythm section. It's more responsible for propagating the groove than the harmony or the melody. This means that bass parts are often very closely intertwined with drum parts, each locking into the other to keep the train on the tracks. A simple approach is just to sync your bass part up with the rhythm of the kick drum, but of course you can do much more complicated things. Just be aware of the two players as a single unit. Now, when picking notes for a bass part, keep in mind that this will almost always be the lowest note in the arrangement, meaning that whatever note the bassist plays defines the inversion. As such, it's pretty common to just have them hammer out the current chord's root. This is a simple, safe approach, but if you don't need anything more complicated, it's often best to stick with it. You can add a little variety by going back and forth between the root and the fifth, or spice things up even more with a third. Honestly, the 7 is rarely a good idea, especially if it's major, but if it works for what you want to do, go for it. You can also include passing tones and other non-harmonic tones, which is something we'll be getting more into in the future. How bass is used also varies a lot by style. For instance, Latin music has a couple really iconic bass lines like this, or this. These patterns are a great way to quickly signal a Latin influence to listeners. In a lot of rock and punk music, bass lines are relatively simple, often just playing straight root eighth notes, or simple syncopated patterns. In jazz music, you have the walking bass, which we could probably do a whole episode on. And you know what? We will. Stay tuned for that. In hard rock or metal, your guitars are often playing riffs instead of chords, and in those situations, the bassist can just double those an octave down. They can also just play really low, heavy, sustained notes to add depth and darkness. But this is a video about bass, and we've waited long enough to address the elephant in the room: funk and R&B. Funk music is probably the first style that comes to mind when people think bass guitar, and for good reason. Unlike most other styles, funk bass isn't content to sit in the background, often taking the role of the dominant driving force in the music. These bass lines can be incredibly hard to write, but there are a few guidelines to keep in mind. Funk bass lines are often very happy to use non-harmonic tones in passing, briefly stepping outside the chords and taking on a much more melodic function. They also make a lot of use of 16th note syncopation, riding the E's and U's. And of course, they often use a slap technique, which is a very percussive playing style that utilizes the thumb to accentuate the intricate rhythms so emblematic of funk music. Putting all that together might sound something like this. There are a couple different ways to use these techniques. The first is in a riff-like capacity, where the same 1 or 2 bar pattern gets played over and over under a simple chord vamp. This is used in more dance-friendly pieces. You're definitely familiar with this in the works of Michael Jackson, and it's a hallmark of funk music. Under less repetitive chord changes, you can also use a more free-form improvised groove. For this, like with guitar, you can just put comping slashes and give them the chord symbol. Write funk on top so they know the style, write slap beneath if that's what you want, and you're good to go. This will give you a looser, freer feel more common to R&B and Motown, and if done right, it sounds great. As always though, comping slashes put a lot of trust in your player, so make sure you have a great bassist. Anyway, that's bass. Try the exercises and keep on rockin'.